Yeah. I sound like 8 years old.
Last week I streamed this sideways. I had my phone like that, and apparently there's an orientation, but the whole thing came out sideways. Still got some views, but yeah, fixed it this week.
Usually it just turns and it lets
That was my assumption, but there is a button for it apparently, so I did find that this week. All right, well, welcome everybody. It looks like we probably have everybody that's going to show up. So for anyone that wasn't here last week, this is Bible history class, and we go through obviously the history of the Bible, but the focus is translations, also things like archaeology and other extra biblical sources that parallel it, things like that. You're looking at the history of the Bible and the history parallel and around the Bible. And the goal of this class is to ground us in our faith. It's to, first off, answer the questions we may have and bring the history of the Bible and the way that God has used people to create the Bible and bring that to life in reality. And also to address evangelical questions. You might get people saying, well, the Bible's been changed over time, and you're going to see that that's not really true. In fact, our Bible's much more accurate today than it was even 500 years ago. And you'll see that today. That's one question we'll deal with today, and then we'll move into the Old Testament today. And then after that, in future classes, we'll move into the New Testament, and then we're slowly going to kind of zero in on the person of Jesus Christ historically and how we can validate his life. And that's really the most important part. We're going to start looking at Old Testament stuff, but I can tell you that the further back you go in time in the Old Testament, because the Old Testament goes back thousands and thousands of years, right? So the further back you go, the harder it is to validate any history at that time. So it gets messier and messier as you move backwards as far as evidence. But the point isn't actually to validate the Old Testament as much as it is to validate Jesus Christ. Even Christians have various views of the Old Testament. Some people are, in our church specifically, is going to be very literalist interpretation. We're going to usually take it for what it says. But a lot of Christian churches and a lot of people, might take a more secular view of things and see the Bible, as the Old Testament, maybe Adam and Eve or Noah's Ark and things like that, as more allegorical or figurative. And they're Christians too, but the point is we got to prove Jesus Christ. And in the Old Testament, we validate enough to say that there is history there, and I think that you got to prove enough of it to point to Jesus Christ, and that's really my goal here. And the prophecies especially are very legitimately pointing to Jesus Christ, and they put God's hand in the text. And you're going to see a really remarkable prophecy that most people don't see because it's a little bit hidden. But I think it's pretty eye-opening as to really seeing God's hand upon the Old Testament pointing to Jesus Christ. So this slide's a little messy looking, but I'll walk us through it. It's just more for my reference to kind of go over what we talked about last week. 0 to present, okay, in time. The Bible was in Greek, and then in 400 they made it into Latin, and that was the dominant text for 1,000 years. Around that time, you had the church becoming a stately power, okay, and for 1,000 years that was it. The church was a state power through the Catholic Church, and they used the Latin text. Then the English started with Whitefield, and he was persecuted, and so were all the guys that started translating out of the Latin there. You had the printing press around that time. Okay, so that was a big deal, the printing press, because now it was easy to make Bibles. Well, you didn't need before this time, you had guys handwriting the entire Bible. You had scribes, usually professional scribes. They'd memorize a page and make it 100 times, and everyone would do that. Or they'd memorize a chapter, or they'd have a guy standing in the front reading the text, and you'd have a few guys writing it down. At a professional level, they were good at these things. There was very few errors. Then you had Luther come along, and he's kind of the poster child of the Reformation. In the Reformation, you're thinking about 15 to 1600-ish. That is when the church started to notice that the Catholics had some doctrines that didn't quite align with the text of the Bible. And as people were becoming more literate and and the text was getting to everybody, there were people with other perspectives, and also information was moving around faster with the printing press. Much like how the internet exploded information, the printing press did too. So information was moving, and then people started to go, you know what? I don't know that I think the Catholics got some things a little wonky here along the way. So they had disagreements, and there was this big split. And now we have Catholicism being about a third of the size of the Christian church. The other 2/3 would be Protestantism. And then Protestantism has a bunch of subgroups like Baptists and Pentecostals. And, we're a Pentecostal church. But you got Baptists around, you got non-denominational churches, you've got Lutheran churches are still around. And so all the denominations that aren't Catholic are Protestant. And they're the ones who the main difference was, some basic ideas about salvation, especially focusing on faith. And more so, I would say the biggest difference is the Catholics see their church as having as much authority as the text, and the Pope having as much authority as the text. Whereas the Protestants just say, no, we're just going by the text. You might hear a word, sola scriptura, means scripture alone, right? So that's where we left off. All right, so today we're going to go into not so much the language and translation over time, but the accuracy of the text. Because people say, well, the Bible's been changed. How do we know it's really what it was meant to say? And by the end of this class, you're going to realize that's not true. And you're gonna see. I'm gonna even show you the very worst of how the Bible has been changed. And I'll tell you what, it's pretty insignificant. Okay. So you'll certainly be prepared to answer that question for everyone and be grounded in that question for yourself and for your own faith. So the question is, how accurate is our New Testament? Now, manuscript, I think we actually have a definition. Okay. Autograph, meaning auto, self, graph, writing, self-writing, original writing, okay? The autographs would be the thing that Paul himself wrote, and that Peter himself wrote, the actual letter that those apostles wrote, the actual books. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Romans, Acts, the original text that was written by their hands. What you also have to realize is there were multiple autographs. There weren't just one. They would keep a copy for themselves. They would send a copy to the church they were going to, and often, sometimes at least, maybe often, but I know at least sometimes. For example, for Ephesians was a group thing. They would send these letters to a group of churches. Okay, so there was sometimes a handful of original texts. Versus a manuscript, meaning manual, script meaning written, manually written, or manually copied. Someone copied it by hand. Okay, so everything up to the printing press is a manuscript. Everything before about the 1400s would be a handwritten copy of the Bible. How many of these manuscripts do we have? We got about 5,800 Greek ones. Okay, so in the original language. Then we have about 120 of those date to between 100 to 400s AD. So we've got over 100 that are quite old. All right, and those aren't full Bibles, but some of them are just the copy of John, just the copy of Peter, right? So it's not always the entire text. And we answered this question last week. Does anyone remember why you didn't get entire Bibles until about the 300s AD? Why don't you get we don't have any copies of the Bible that are the entire New Testament put together in one book before the 300s AD? Anyone remember why? Yes, the canonization. In the 300s was the time where they finally said, okay, we're going to bind all these books into one text and call it our Bible. All right, before that, they were separate books that generally, I mean, we've got copies of canons going back to the 2nd century. So they had a list of books that they said these are legitimately from the apostles. These are writings from the apostles, and it was pretty much our entire old New Testament. The whole thing's there pretty much, even in some of the earliest, like the Muratorian fragment, 150 AD. I want to say, and it basically has the New Testament in it already. So the canon was there the whole time, but it wasn't made like really official until the 300s AD, where they just said, okay, we're sticking this into one text, binding it on one binding, and it's going to be one book. So that's why we don't get entire New Testaments until the 300s AD. But before that, we've got plenty of kind of loose leaf books where the books were separate; they were all their own book. And so, yeah, so we have them, quite a few from early dates, and over 140 in other languages from the hundreds to 400s AD. So you figure we've got, that's 260 copies of the books of the Bible from the first few centuries. Okay, that's quite a bit. Not only that, but in total we've got 19,000 copies of the Bible in other languages of manuscripts. So again, manuscripts being before 1400. Some of these also go back to the 2nd century. This is a lot, just so you guys know. That's a lot. If you like, most writings from this time don't even have 10 copies. You know, we've got tens of thousands. What? Yeah, it sure was. And the beauty is that when you have so many copies from so early, if anything was ever changed, you just go back and say, this one's different than the other 100 we have, so obviously this one's wrong, right? So it's very easy to tell if there was an error brought in. Usually errors were just, they skipped a line, they misspelled the sentence or misspelled the word, left a sentence out on accident, left a word out. That's usually all it was. Occasionally you get a couple words thrown in there that were usually from a parallel passage, but rarely. And fasting, yep.
The biggest
Yes. How accurate are these? Well, 99% of the text is the same, right? So if you've got, let's say we're looking at just text from the 100 to 400s, 99% of it's all the same, right? And almost entirely spelling errors. Then you got grammar errors. And then for meaningful errors, you're just talking a 0.1%, percent of a percent. That'd be, sorry, a tenth of a percent. So tiny little bit. So meaningful would mean they left a sentence out or they added a sentence in, something like, or they added a word in or left a word out. Usually it's leaving words out, but you know, omissions, much more common, right? So again, like, this is what people think when they criticize the Bible. And this is what people think when they think historically. But this is just, it's too simple. It's not how it works. What really happened was you got the autograph, and again, you've usually got multiple autographs. Okay, almost always you're going to have at least two, but many times handfuls. And these will branch out, and what you do is the historians today are great at this stuff. There's people whose jobs, they work in universities and teach this stuff, and their job is just to look at this. These are called textual critics, okay? And these critics, they go, error here in that lineage. They say, this is a perfect lineage. Okay, the Alexandrian text was great. These were great scribes. They did a great job. This is some of our best texts, and some of the oldest Bibles we have were amongst those best texts. And then these guys, they were moderate scribes. This guy made a mistake, and that lineage was bad. But so they get to look at these things as family trees. And this is why I say our Bibles are more accurate than they were 500 years ago. Okay, this is why I'm saying that, because over time, our knowledge and information sharing has gotten better, and they've really done a great job at making the text better than it was previously. Do we have autographs, the original text? I would say sort of. Again, there were many copies of these autographs sent to many churches. Each of them were copied many times, so there was an immediate exponential growth of the autographs being copied. Errors were easy to spot. You know, you saw that one line that's red. Early Christians engaged in preserving and analyzing biblical texts for accuracy. Guys like Origen, Tatian, and Irenaeus in the 2nd century even. And God may supernaturally preserve his word, but this evidence shows that it wasn't even all that necessary. I mean, God was moving through these people's hearts to actually do this. So he kind of did, but he did it through people in a lot of ways, right? Not that he may not have made sure that some of these old Bibles, stuck around longer than they should have, but it's also not that uncommon to have some copies of texts of that age. So again, it's just you see God working through men's hearts, and we can be confident that our modern text is an accurate copy of the autographs because of this. I think our text, it's very hard to argue that we're missing much of anything or have anything much different than the original text. I think that's a very difficult argument to make. So let's talk about the actual significant variants. Again, the significant meaning, there's actually words added or subtracted, and these are very rare. Um, and almost always it's going to be omissions, which are very obvious when you read it, and very understandable. um, there's not that many examples, really. I'm going to give you a few, but the Lord's Prayer, "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever, amen," Matthew 6:13. That was absent from the text until the 6th and 7th century. Most Bibles, again, will put an asterisk on it, or they'll put a note in the margin. So you'll see, maybe it'll be in, I think the NIV will put it in brackets, where my NASB will put it in italics, or no, they'll put the little stars, the asterisks around it or behind it. And at the bottom of the page, there's a note that has the asterisk, and it says, this wasn't present in some of the earlier manuscripts. So like nobody's hiding that this happened, okay? There's no conspiracy to make the Bible look better than it ever was, or to make it look like it's perfectly preserved. Like, it's like we're just being honest about it. Like it's there. It's kind of an insignificant thing to like. It's not like it changes church doctrine, right? But we're not hiding it. It is what it is. Math. So there's been some people claiming that the ending of Mark 16 is the last chapter of Mark, 9 through 20, isn't authentic. And it's because two of the earliest Greek manuscripts lack the passage. However, one of them, actually two of our earliest entire Bibles, the Sinaiticus and Vaticanus from the 300s AD, they don't have it. It's like the entire New Testament, the oldest full New Testaments we have don't have that. And one of them actually left a blank page for it there, but didn't write it in. Leaving a blank page wasn't something you did. You did not waste paper back in that day. So it's very significant that they left that there. They knew it was supposed to be there, or that they at least knew that it was there in some way. But they left it out for some reason. I do wonder if they just didn't like the text. They don't like the passage. It's a passage that's the one where Jesus talks about Christians doing miracles. And so it's controversial because some Christians just don't, like, we're in a Pentecostal church. We're used to miracles here, okay? But some churches don't really vibe with that. They don't do the miracles. They don't believe it. They don't think God does that stuff. They don't see it. They've never seen a miracle in their life, despite being a Christian for so many years. That's very common. And so maybe there's some of that. But however, many writers quote the long ending of Mark before these Greek manuscripts were written. So we know it was there historically. And actually, there's millions of commentaries that go back all the way to the 1st century. Commentaries being people who wrote about the Bible were writing about this. So it's really there from the beginning. But what happened was, when you have a loose leaf book before the Bible was put together, that last page is the back page. You might just tear out the back page on accident and lose the page. I think a lineage lost the last page, and that got into the lineage of these oldest New Testaments that we have. And just to show you the scope of it, there you go. Blue has it, red doesn't. So blue has the passage, the red doesn't have the passage. So our oldest full Bibles in Greek don't have it, but everything else everywhere pretty much does have it. What? I think that's some of them had it and some didn't. Yeah. But yeah, like obviously it's legitimate. It's just that like somebody tore a page out and lost it. Like it happens. So, but some Christians actually stick to this, and what they are is they're the Christians who don't like the spiritual gifts. The Christians who claim like the gifts are dead and the miracles aren't happening like they used to, and because it's got that passage that they don't like. so it's not really all that contended that the passage doesn't belong there. Like obviously it belongs there. It's just so, some lineage just had an issue where they lost that last page.
It's funny that it's all like it's just that one
Yeah,
century that it's missing.
sure is. It sure is funny.
So they had it before and
Yep.
they had it after.
Yeah. Yep. So like somewhere in the 3rd century, you probably had a copy that lost the page, and then it was probably a group that put out a lot of copies of the Bible, and they lost the page and just kept running with it, and it ended up spreading about a little bit. But then in the 5th century, yeah, that kind of goes away. Like that, yeah, like they must have realized, hey, this is missing something. Yeah. And yeah, maybe enough copies of the Bible went around that they said, oh, these are different. This one's got the rest of it. We'll talk about the King James a little bit. I'm not specifically picking on the King James, okay? All the Bibles from the King James times had these issues, but I'm picking on the King James because there's people who say like if you're not reading King James, you're not a real Christian, and like I'm just showing you that our texts have actually gotten more accurate since the King James times. That's my point. Okay, there's no like telephone game where the text has changed over time. The text was very accurate, as accurate as it always was. There was a couple little issues along the way, and actually in the last 500 years, we've gotten the Bible to be more and more accurate because our information sharing has gotten better. So really, I would say the King James is as bad as the Bible gets. Like as far as these little additions getting in, and here's the thing, the difference is insignificant. It's a great text if it works for you. If you like that language that I find a little hard to understand, fine, it works for you. But don't pretend like you're a superior Christian because you read Old English. Okay, that's all I'm saying. And so I'm going to go through these not to pick on anybody, but to show that our Bibles have become more accurate in the last few hundred years. Okay. And our scholarship's improved, and the text has become much more sharpened over time. As an example, the King James was translated in 1500 from manuscripts that were from this time period, okay? Whereas our modern text, because we have the internet and we've found more copies from older times in the last 500 years, our modern texts are from 3 to 500, so from this time period, okay? So if you're just going to say, well, if there was a couple little additions thrown in there over time, obviously those ones are more accurate than these ones. And I'll show you a few of the things that snuck in there along the way. The Johannine comma made its way in there. So the highlighted part was added to the Latin text in 500 AD. And it was absent from the Greek altogether until the 1400s, where it made its way into the King James for 1600. So this is John 1:5-7-8. For there are 3 that bear record. All right, so the way it should read is the Spirit, the water, and the blood, and these 3 agree in one. But the way it reads in the King James would be, there are 3 that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these 3 are one, and there are 3 that bear witness on earth, the Spirit, the water, and the blood, and these 3 agree in one. So the significance of this is basically nothing. Like it's just basic church doctrine kind of getting thrown in there. I don't know if it was probably a commentary. Usually these are commentaries that instead of writing it at the bottom of the page, they accidentally put it in the middle of the page. That's usually how these editions like this get in there. It was a commentary that they forgot to put at the bottom, and it snuck its way into the text. And then they just kept copying it, and like there it is. But we can see on that timeline, like it was a certain set of texts that had it. But it just happened to make its way into the Greek right before the King James, and the King James happened to get that copy of the text that had it, and they included it.
Out of context. like if you read the verse before it that says, this is in the King James.
Yeah.
It says, "This is he that came by water and blood, even Jesus Christ, not by water only, but by water and blood. And it is the Spirit that beareth witness, because the Spirit is truth." So to add that in there, it's out of context.
Yeah, it comes off topic and then back into it.
Yeah.
And yeah, you can see it definitely flows better without the addition there. My opinion of the King James is if it works for you, great. If God's speaking to you through it, great, read it. I don't give that to people as their first Bible. You know, I give them an easier read as their first Bible because I want them to absorb as much as they can in a language they can understand. And the Bible's already hard enough to understand because you're reading ancient history from a different time and place, and the people were very strange compared to us. And their thought processes and their culture was very strange compared to us. And we don't even understand a lot of the references they're making, let alone understand 500-year-old English that uses words that don't even exist anymore. So yeah, it just if it works for you, great. If it doesn't, find something else. That's all. Here's a funny one: the Wicked Bible. It says there's an error in it. Thou shalt commit adultery. Yeah, that was in there. That's funny, huh? This was in the Bible Museum. I snapped this photo from the Bible Museum in Washington D.C. Excellent visit if any of you can go. That was 1631, and it was open to the page too, so you can see it right in there. But it also puts the description right here. Yeah, that's a 1631 Wicked Bible. So that was funny. That's imagine that. Imagine reading your Bible and reading that. And again, there's no conspiracy to cover this stuff up. Like it happens, and it's funny. Just some other stuff, simple stuff. The name of Moses. In the King James, it would say son of Manasseh. In NIV, it would say son of Moses. So obviously there was the name sounds similar in the Hebrew, and sometimes the older translators just didn't quite get it right. Some locations, just again, really like basic, simple stuff. This King James said King Arad, and the NAS would say King of Arad. Okay, so is it his name or is it where he's the king of? But Arad's a place, so yeah. And then also spies versus Atharim. So again, it's just an interpretation of the Greek, not being as the scholarship's better today. So they've just done a little more. Our resources are better today, so we just have a few little tweaks that got better along the way. There's also a unicorn in the King James. Again, though, this is Old English, so like I don't think this is a reference to like the mythical creature with the horse and the rainbow mane and the candy horn, and that's like a bull or a rhino, kind of thing. Again, 500-year-old English, but this is an example of like 500-year-old English is just different. Like it's just the words are different. Okay, it's 500 years old. It's thee and thy and thou. It's just we don't use that anymore. So to conclude this section, the New Testament is essentially the best attested ancient writing in the world. If you compare it to other writings from that time, we've got thousands of fold more copies of it and probably thousands of fold more accuracy too. Modern translations are accurate to the original Bible message. I would say even accurate, probably 99.9% accurate to more than that. I'd say 99.999% accurate to the original text. Because if you're thinking if only 0.1% is inaccurate, and most of those are omissions, you're talking very, very, very few additions and stuff that's easily been picked out. And I just can't imagine that there's anything significantly wrong with our text that really makes it vary from the original text by now. What I just showed you, the issues with the King James, very insignificant, and that is the worst it's gotten through history. That is the absolute worst version of the Bible you could ever find. And that's all it is. Like these things are insignificant. And so anyone that says the Bible's been changed over time, you now know how much it's been changed. And you now know that we've fixed it. And we put notes in the margins, and we're not hiding anything. Okay? So, yeah, our Bibles are accurate, and they're solid, and they're solidly the Word of God written by the apostles, and we do solidly have the words written by the apostles. Okay? So we,
Still be writing? Still like another generation?
generation of what?
Like, is there going to be a new Testament? Like, are we still going
Oh,
to
is the
follow
no the canon's closed. So in other words, the things we see in the New Testament are written by apostles, or by people closely associated with the apostle. For example, Mark wrote from what Peter told him. Okay, so Mark was Peter's like disciple. So Peter told him stuff, and Mark wrote it down. So Mark is directly from Peter. So basically, the whole New Testament that we have is directly from apostles. Okay, the only other questionable one would be Hebrews, which you don't know the author of, but you got a lot of Paulish stuff in there. Most likely it was Paul and someone else writing, or someone who was maybe a disciple of Paul writing it. But the Hebrews writer directly says, we got this from eyewitnesses. So he's directly going from the apostles. But basically, the idea is that all those canonized books are directly from apostles. That's the point. They're directly from the people who lived and walked and were disciples of Jesus Christ. And so church writings after that time, we don't consider canon. They can teach us great stuff, but we don't add to the Bible anything that wasn't directly from the apostles of Jesus, okay? Unless you're a Mormon. Mormons actually just say, now our prophets can write more Bible. Because Joseph Smith told me, yes. We get into that a little bit in the next class, the varying beliefs. We touch on Mormonism, and so it's interesting.
So just going back to what I said, today, if you hear so, oh, we found the new text, oh, we found this, like the book of Jude, the book of whatever, you can read it, right? There's no sin in reading it. However, most of the time it's just a waste of time. Because what he said was 300 AD, that canon. So that's your Bible period. Nothing more,
Yep.
nothing less.
Yep.
No.
No, because there's nothing else to add. There's nothing else from the apostles. There's a few books from the 200s AD that claim to be from apostles, but they're not. And the church, even in that day, we have their writings saying these ones are from apostles, these ones are not. And so there are some people, you might see random stuff on Facebook and internet. Social media is just anything you read on social media that's making a claim, just assume the opposite is true, okay? Very rare that you get accurate information on social media. People are, because generally you got to defer to experts. Like experts are almost always going to be right. Not that experts can't be wrong, but generally experts on it, and people on social media aren't experts, therefore they're wrong. That's what it comes down to, right? What translations do you guys like? Yes, English. Yes, in English. What do you read?
I use the New King James.
New King
And I
James.
checked that one verse, so in the New King James, they corrected it to wild ox instead of the unicorn.
The wild ox.
Yeah,
Yep. Yep. That's
So
yeah.
like the New King James will clear up most of those, if not all, of those
Yeah.
discrepancies.
Yeah. Or again, it'll have a note in the margin saying, "Hey, this wasn't in some of the older texts."
No. And what he says, everything he said is correct and true. So the New King James will clear that up. And then, as brother knows well, usually people that are 50 and above, the reason why they like the King James is that poetic, right?
And they're used to it.
Yeah, they're used to it, right? So like when I started reading, the King James was the main version. So I started reading it, and I didn't read well. I didn't comprehend well. So going back to what he said, you find like, wow, what does that word mean? You know, like a simple one, let your conversation, but it didn't mean your discourse, it meant your lifestyle, the we're in conversation here, right?
Yeah.
So, but again, if you're hungry for God, because you have to remember back in that day, that was the most read translation. So
Yeah.
God's not going to let you hang. If you're really hungry for God, people just crank it up and learn and grow. But what he says is actually right. So I like the New King James because I still like that. You know how people make fun of the Amplified Bible, like it's like 30 words.
Extra.
Yeah.
Right. So that's why like people like me don't like those 2 lines. Just way too many words. It's hard to memorize it.
Yeah.
That was the other thing. King James was easy to memorize because it's poetic.
It's true.
It's short.
It's true.
So that it helps you actually memorize it.
Well, a lot of our quoted by memory verses are King James
Right.
still.
Yeah.
And
That's
you're right; it's
true.
very easy to remember it, and it's almost a tradition that's been carried down.
Right, exactly.
And some of the words we use are those old English words like sanctify and repent. Those were really more common words 500 years ago, and nowadays we got no clue what those mean. So you got to actually, if you're evangelizing, if you're explaining the gospel to a person that you know at work or something, you can't really use those words, okay? Because they're just not going to know what you just got to explain it in lay terms. So sometimes that takes a little practice too. What do you read?
I mean, I have my ESV. I like my New American Standard I just got is really nice.
Yep,
But I've
I
been
like that.
reading ESV for a while. And as somebody who grew up having to read the King James every day and having no clue what it meant, I really like my ESV.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I like those are my favorite too. NAS and ESV. Yeah. What do you like?
Well, my study Bible is in
King James. Yeah.
when I first started,
Yeah.
I was on
Yeah. And like you said, that's what was popular back then. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know what you're saying, but I just kept at it.
Well, we've really had an explosion of translations in the last few decades. We've got a lot more translations of the Bible now than we did even just 10, 20, 30 years ago. So that's one big difference we have today. And honestly, I've read and compared things to a lot of them. They're almost all the same. There's a few bad ones, but they're very, very rare. For example, the Jehovah's Witness, they have a New World Translation that makes Jesus into not being God. Obviously, that's an issue. And obviously, that's a bias. And we actually get into that next class, but we'll leave that where it is. Were you saying something too?
Well, in Spanish, there's this version that's kind of similar to King James, this old language from Spain, and it's so hard to understand sometimes. And there's no other easier version. At least when I try to get a English Spanish, a double language,